Dear all, it is my great pleasure to welcome all of you, the audience here in the University Aula in Bergen, Norway, as well as viewers around the world, to the Holberg Debate 2025. My name is Jørgen Sejersted, and I am the chair of the board of the Holberg Prize. The Holberg Prize is one of the world's largest international prizes awarded to outstanding scholars in the humanities, social sciences, law, or theology. The prize was established by the Norwegian government in 2003 in homage to the 18th century scholar Ludvig Holberg. In addition to the academic events that are held in June each year in celebration of the Holberg Prize laureate, the Holberg Debate is held annually in December in remembrance of the intellectual curiosity and societal engagement of Ludvig Holberg, whose birthday was on the 3rd of December. The Holberg Debate aims to engage prominent academics as well as non-academics in public debate on pressing issues of our time. The title of this year's debate is the question, is collective security dead? On the panel, we are very proud to present Professor Mary Kaldor, Professor Emeritus at the London School of Economics and Political Science, Professor Stephen Walt, Professor of International Affairs at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, and the Right Honourable Boris Johnson, former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. They will all be properly introduced shortly, but for now let me extend a warm welcome to all of you and thank you for being here in Bergen. We are also very pleased to have with us British journalist Stephen Walt as moderator of this event. Stephen Walt is a writer, broadcaster and internationally renowned journalist. He was foreign correspondent for the BBC and presenter of Hard Talk, very popular program, from 2005 to 25. He is now a presenter of Times Radio's Times at 1. He is a graduate of Cambridge and Harvard universities and holds honorary doctorates from Warwick University and the Geneva School of International Diplomacy. He is currently writing a book entitled Hard Truth, to be published in 2026. We are truly honored to have you with us, Stephen, so please, the floor is now yours.
Thanks so much, thank you. Well, what a lovely introduction and a very, very good evening, everybody. I have to say, I've been in Bergen 24 hours. I've already fallen in love with this place. It's beautiful. It doesn't rain, and apparently it never rains in Bergen. That's what local people tell me. But also there seems to be this thirst for the exchange of ideas. When I learned that not only was this event sold out, but there was a waiting list of 1,000 people to get their hands on tickets if you guys didn't show up, I thought, my God, that says something really rather wonderful about the good people of Bergen. So it is a great pleasure for me to be here. And I should say also that as I felt it was my duty to do, I did a little bit of research into Ludvig Holberg, who I confess I knew, frankly, very little about before being invited to moderate and chair this debate. And thanks to the glories of Wikipedia, I have learned in the last 24 hours that this man was an extraordinary figure in the European Enlightenment. He believed that, and this is relevant to tonight, he believed that we all had within us an inner divine light of reason. And ladies and gentlemen, I think we are going to see that divine light of reason revealed in the next couple of hours. He also said that students of any age should nurture their senses and their inborn intellect, not uselessly memorize books. So here we all are to listen to three wonderful speakers full of ideas tonight. We don't need to memorize their books, we just need to listen to enjoy the spectacle of them sharing their ideas with us face to face. I think that's a rather wonderful thing. So God bless Ludvig Holberg, and God bless the three people who are going to be our main speakers tonight. We've heard who they are. I'll just give you a little bit more information about each of them, starting with Boris Johnson, whom many of you will be very familiar with. He's been a major figure on the British political scene for many years. He was Prime Minister from 2019 to 2022. Before that, he was Foreign Secretary. He was Mayor of London. I believe we've got the Mayor of this beautiful city here with us tonight, and perhaps the two of them can share some ideas about being a successful mayor later on. But he was quite a successful re-elected Mayor of London from 2008 to 16. I had the pleasure of interviewing Boris Johnson when he was Mayor of London. He enjoyed it so much that he refused to be interviewed by me ever again. But nonetheless, we've thoroughly enjoyed each other's company tonight, and I think we might even have a drink after this, so things can improve. He's also a great writer. We were just discussing his love of words earlier. He's written books about Churchill. He's also written a memoir which is called Unleashed, which makes him sound a bit like a pit bull terrier that has escaped from its owner. But nonetheless, it's a book which gives you a flavor of the drama of his political career, which, let us not forget, also involved being one of the most important campaigners for Brexit in the United Kingdom. Did I hear somebody boo just then? I don't know. Anyway, we're not going to waste too much time talking about Brexit, but it might come up a bit later on. We also have two other fabulous speakers, both of them sort of from the world of academia, but both of them whose work has spanned interests far beyond academia. Professor Mary Kaldor has long been based at the London School of Economics. She is the Emeritus Professor of Global Governance. She still directs a conflict research group at the LSE. She's particularly focused on two conflicts at the moment, Ukraine and also post-Assad Syria. And I think we'll get some thoughts from her on both of those as we go forward. She's written books on old wars and new wars. She's spent a great deal of her life considering how wars happen and whether we are right now in a state of uncertainty in the world that makes conflict and war more likely. And I think that's something we're going to discuss tonight as well. Rather wonderfully, she said to me earlier as we were chatting that she's been arrested twice in her life because she is also a campaigner and activist as well as an academic. She was arrested once as a campaigner against nuclear weapons and against proliferation of nuclear weapons when she was a very young girl of 15, and alongside her at the time was the great British philosopher Bertrand Russell. And if you're going to be arrested, I think being arrested alongside Bertrand Russell is the way to do it. And then, also rather wonderfully, she was arrested in Prague, I believe in 1988, when she'd just visited Václav Havel, and the Czech authorities, which of course was the year before the regime collapsed, the Czech authorities took umbrage at the meeting of Mary and Václav and promptly threw her out the country. So she's got a track record, I think, ladies and gentlemen, that suggests that she really walks the walk as well as talks the talk. And our final speaker tonight is Stephen Walt. He's the Belfer Professor of International Affairs at Harvard's John F. Kennedy School of Government. I'm delighted to say I had a year at the JFK School myself, so I know that only the brightest and the best ever cross the portals of the JFK School. He was dean from 2002 to 2006. I noticed that his period as dean then ended actually just before, I think, or during the furore caused by one of his books. He's written many important books, but one which I think is relevant to the debate today, but also deeply relevant to the time we live in, was called The Israel Lobby and US Foreign Policy. And it's a book which caused a stir at the time, and I think it's still well worth reading today, and indeed it's still being new imprints are being made today. And I think, again, there are thoughts within that book that we will reflect on as we talk about collective security and the state of the world. So, ladies and gentlemen, we have a fabulous panel. This debate and this meeting tonight couldn't be more timely, as I'm sure many of you have seen and read and reflected upon. Just a couple of days ago, the White House released a new national security strategy, which was Donald Trump and his administration's attempt to define what the US's view of the world is and how it wants to conduct foreign policy going forward. It contains in it many different thoughts, but overwhelmingly it suggests to me that 80 years of assumptions about the nature of the transatlantic alliance can be thrown in the bin. that they no longer are relevant, and that the United States sees the world in a very different way from all of the administrations that have preceded it since the Second World War. So I think something really important is happening right now that this debate will get to the heart of. We also talk, of course, as Volodymyr Zelensky is again in Western Europe talking to European leaders about how the defense of Ukraine can be maintained at a time when clearly the United States is taking a view that the war needs to end, and frankly needs to end on terms that seem satisfactory to Vladimir Putin. So Ukraine is going to be something that we will be talking about tonight. But there are many other issues too. You know, we're all aware that the conflict in Gaza has sort of, and I emphasize sort of, ended, but it is very much a fragile ceasefire, not really an end to the conflict. And that's a conflict that I suspect many of us in this room care about a great deal. And then around the world, there's extraordinary uncertainty, whether it be about the future of NATO, the utility of the United Nations, the meaning of international law, whether it really means very much anymore in the world we live in, how we handle challenges that need collaboration and collective approaches, like climate change, like the threat from artificial intelligence if it isn't handled responsibly by countries around the world. These are things where collective approaches are surely the only approaches that can work in the future. So there is a very great deal to talk about, and it's time for me to stop talking and allow our esteemed contributors to begin their presentation. So let me invite up to the stage, first of all, Boris Johnson.
Thank you very much, everybody. Good evening. Good evening. It's a great, great pleasure to be here at the Holberg Debate. And speaking as a former mayor of London, can I just take this opportunity to say thank you, Norway, for all the Christmas trees over many, many, many years. And thank you for inviting me to this beautiful city. Stephen's completely right. Living proof of what I used to tell the tourists in London. It is not raining more than 90% of the time. And Bergen has clearly a location that makes it the quintessential Atlantic city, because it was from the West Norwegian coast that those hardy adventurers set out on the whale road, the seal bath, the field of ships, the ale of waves, other beautiful old Norse words for the sea that penetrated early English poetry, and such was their energy that they came to Britain, where he ruled us for a while, and Ireland, Iceland, Greenland, Normandy, Sicily, across the Mediterranean, right the way to Ukraine. In 1000 AD, the Vikings actually became the first Europeans to get to North America and to create the first beginnings of the linguistic, cultural, political bond between Europe and America that has been the greatest and most decisive geopolitical fact of the last 150 years, helped deliver humanity from tyranny, First World War, Second World War, Cold War, because the transatlantic alliance was collectively willing to pay the price for freedom and to stand up to aggression. And that is what we in Britain and Norway are called upon to do again today. We have come to the first great turning point of the 21st century. Our generation, everybody in this room, everybody on our continent is going to be judged by this moment. The answer to all the debates, I think the title of this debate is about collective security, all the debates about the future of our collective security can be found in the way we respond to this immediate question, which is, do we have the courage to ensure the survival of Ukraine as a free, sovereign and independent country? As we meet tonight, the Ukrainians are continuing to fight and die in the name, as we constantly tell them, of our freedom, but without a single Western soldier committed to join them in the battle. This is a country whose borders we all recognize, and Russia recognized in 1991, whose security was nominally guaranteed in 1994, and which has been at no stage a threat to the Russia of Vladimir Putin. I was sitting in virtually every significant NATO meeting from 2016 to 2022, and there was never a snowball's chance in Hades of Ukraine joining NATO, because any such suggestion would have attracted the immediate veto of France, Germany, the USA, and many other states. There would have been a caviar bowl of blackballs. And it is a damnable lie for Putin now to claim that he was driven to invade by NATO expansionism, when he is the expansionist, he is the revanchist and neo-imperialist who set out to conquer Ukraine because he is terrified of the implications for him, for Putin, for the Kremlin, of the Ukrainian choice to set out down the path away from Moscow towards a free, pluralist, democratic, Western European identity. And that's what he hates. That's what he fears. And that's why he invaded. And he did it not because Ukraine was protected by NATO or because Ukraine was going to join NATO, but precisely because it wasn't protected by NATO. And even so, it turned out that he made a disastrous mistake, which has cost him 1.1 million killed or wounded for less than 20% of the country in a war where, unless we are weak, he has no serious chance of winning. A snail would get to the Polish border faster at this rate than Putin's troops. And of course, in the face of the continuing misery, the untold suffering of the Ukrainians, it is right to make peace. Everybody in this room wants peace. Europeans want peace. President Trump wants peace. The world wants peace. And the Ukrainians want peace. The question is how we can get Putin to make peace and preserve Ukraine as a free, sovereign, and independent country. And right now, the Ukrainians are being told by some US negotiators that they will have to accept the loss of the whole of the Donbass, including Kramatorsk and Sloviansk, about 5,000 square kilometers of territory that Putin does not even occupy. Think what that concession means for soldiers who've been fighting since 2014. And remember what happens to territory that's taken by Putin, right? The wholesale kidnap of children, the torture and mutilation of those who resist, a program of violent Russification, including the murder of about 80 Orthodox non-Russian priests so far. This prospect, surrendering their land, is a nightmare for Ukraine. A nightmare made worse by the almost unbelievable suggestion that the United States would formally recognize land that Russia has stolen as Russian, which would be the first time that Washington has done any such thing since the Second World War. But you know, appalling though this prospect is, I think the Ukrainians might. Such is their desire for peace. They might accept some compromise on Donbass. And they might accept the capping of their armed forces, if and only if they seriously believe that they have a future as an independent country, and if they believe that we in the West would guarantee their security. The Ukrainians would do a peace deal if they possibly could, but the Ukrainians are not the problem. Where is the evidence that Putin wants peace? Why should he not just pocket these appalling concessions, gloating at the moral humiliation of the West, and continue his campaign of bombing and killing? Now, what kind of pressure are we really putting on Vladimir Putin right now? What's the message he's getting from these negotiators? Ceasefire, Putin, ceasefire, or else we walk away. Ceasefire, or else we abandon the Ukrainians. The only chance of ending this war is for all of us to turn up the heat on Putin. And it is my central message, it's no use for us Europeans just to blame the Americans. When Europe is still buying Russian gas and paying about $1 billion a month straight into Putin's war machine, and it's no use us sitting here in beautiful Bergen and whimpering about the document that came out on Friday, the strategy document to which Stephen referred, when the average American citizen is paying $3,000 a year in tax on defense, and the average European citizen is paying what? $900. 3,000 against 900, when we in Europe have a vast panoply of expensive social protections, maternity leave, paternity leave, heaven knows what. How many weeks holiday do you have in Norway per year? 5. How many do they have in America? Have you been to America? Have you seen how hard they work? 2 weeks holiday a year. Well, the Americans have noticed this difference. And until very recently, the American taxpayer was actually paying more for the defense of Ukraine than the average European taxpayer. And I have to tell you that Donald Trump is not alone in thinking that the Europeans have been free-riding for too long. And so if we want to take our collective security seriously, if we want the Americans to take it seriously, we have to show them that we take it seriously ourselves. And ask any Ukrainian general how much they depend on the US for support in fighting this war, and they will tell you that the Americans have been indispensable. And as President Trump has mentioned in the past, I think it would be a good thing now if the US were to give the Tomahawk cruise missiles as well, with their ability to strike deep at Russian military targets. But it would help if the Europeans now led the way. Britain and France have sent Storm Shadow and Scalp, e.g. Why can't the Germans send their Taurus missiles? After almost 4 years of talking about it, why can't we liberate Putin's funds that are frozen in European bank accounts and use them as reparations loan to Ukraine? There's $140 billion at least in Belgium, 20 billion in London, about 18 billion in Paris. That money could be lent to the Ukrainians as a down payment on the reparations that Russia should legally and morally render for the damage estimated at well over 600 billion that they have done in Ukraine. And of course, if Russia does pay those reparations, then Ukraine repays the loan. But in the meantime, that money would keep the Ukrainians going and pay their troops for years. Why haven't we done it? Because we're nervous about some future Russian legal action? It is absolutely absurd. The European Council meets on December the 18th. They should green-light this. But in the meantime, the UK government, which, as Stephen reminds you, I used to lead, should get going and do it ourselves with the 20 billion that we have in London. Because it would not only be a massive boost to the Ukrainians, but it would persuade Putin that we are serious about ending this war and that we will ratchet up the price that he has to pay. And for the same reason, we should follow the Trump administration in discriminating against all countries that continue to buy Putin's hydrocarbons and to fund his war machine. We should crack down on his shadow fleet that helps him to avoid sanctions. And if one of them should find its way to the bottom of the whale road, then so much the better. And as for the coalition of the willing, the plan to put European boots on the ground, which I know Norway supports, and my question is, why are we waiting? There are plenty of parts of Ukraine that are frankly as safe as Bergen, and Bergen seems very safe indeed. We could send those troops now, not in a war-fighting role, but to give training and logistical support, if only to make this crucial point that it is up to the Ukrainians to decide which foreign troops to invite onto their soil and not up to Vladimir Putin. The Ukrainians want peace. They are desperate to settle, but they cannot and will not settle without proper security guarantees. And we can't just return to the status quo antebellum with Ukraine in a security limbo, with now a big chunk of their country in Russian hands. They will need new and convincing guarantees that they will be protected in the future. European boots on the ground, US air cover, intelligence, and all the rest of it. And you say, Putin will never accept such terms. I would answer, we haven't even tried. We're offering all the carrot to Putin and all the stick to Ukraine when it should be the other way around. If we are strong now, we can end the war with Ukraine, remaining a free, independent country. But if we're weak, then Ukraine becomes a tragic, brutalized satellite of Moscow, culture and language systematically oppressed. And we give the green light to gangsterism and aggression around the world, from the Baltic states to Taiwan. It will be if that is the result, it will be the worst defeat for the United States since Vietnam, never mind Afghanistan. It will be the worst defeat for the Atlantic Alliance and our values since Britain and Norway became founding members of that alliance 76 years ago. And we, the UK and Norway, have much to be proud of. Strategic partnership that's gone from strength to strength, including, as my friend Jens Stoltenberg reminded me yesterday, a program now to build 5 frigates together. But we must remember the reason we founded that NATO alliance, and it was because the catastrophe of the 1940s had followed the moral failure of the 1930s, when we tried to appease a revanchist aggressor by allowing him to gobble up his neighbors. And we deluded ourselves into thinking we could do a deal with him and that there was a limit to his territorial demands. We cannot make that mistake again. I think Putin has badly miscalculated, and that the Ukrainian desire for freedom and independence is now irreversible. But we can avert so much suffering and save so many lives if we bring peace now. And the only way to do that is to turn things round, for the West to unite, and to put the pressure now, not on the victim, but on the man who started the war, on Putin. And the only way for us now to unite in the West is for Europeans to take steps now, now this month, to convince the Americans that we are serious about our own security. Thank you all very much.
Thanks, Boris. Thank you very much indeed, Boris Johnson. Took a lot out of him, that, and he's had to take some refreshments, and you go ahead and enjoy, Boris. I hadn't anticipated in the course of Boris's presentation that he'd be haranguing you guys in Bergen for having too much holiday, but there you go.
Little.
No, I get the point, and it actually there's a serious point to be made there, and we thank you very much, Boris, for opening us up with such a passionate exposition, particularly on the significance, the absolutely crucial significance of what is happening in Ukraine right now. And I promise you we're going to spend much more time unpicking that in our discussion that follows our 3 opening presentations, but much more besides, because we do want to look at different ways in which this idea of collective security and its possible demise plays out around the world. Let us turn to our second presentation. It is my very great pleasure now to invite onto the stage Professor Mary Kaldor. Mary, the stage is yours.
Well, thank you so much for that lovely introduction, and thank you so much to the Holberg Prize for inviting us to what is, I think, a really important discussion. And it's going to be quite hard for me to say all the things I want to say in 15 minutes. So oddly, I'm quite glad that we've got another 2 hours to thrash out this subject. And so my starting point is that I think this is a very, very dangerous moment in history. One of these moments that come every 80 to 100 years, sort of a cataclysmic historical moment. Many of you will be familiar with the phrase of Gramsci, the old is dying and the new cannot be born. And in this interregnum are all sorts of morbid symptoms. And I think those include the war in Ukraine, the war in Palestine. It's a very frightening moment. And I call this moment, which will sound odd to all of you, an experimental juncture. And what I mean by this is that it's one of those great turning points in history when terrible things happen. But I call it experimental because they're existential moments when actually politicians don't know what to do and they experiment. And some of their experiments are really bad, like invading other countries or imprisoning migrants. And, or if we go back to the 1930s, killing Jews and Roma. But sometimes they come up with good experiments that are pushed for in society. And we only know they're good experiments when they restore legitimacy, they create a kind of consensus, and we go back to some sort of stability. And I suppose what I want to argue today is that I think that's only going to be possible through collective security. I don't think collective security is dead, but it's certainly very, very ill. And I think that if we want to escape from our current predicament, we've got to find a new way, a new form of collective security. So what might that be? Well, what do we mean by collective security? First, I think something that people in the Nordic countries are very aware of. First is the idea that we're only safe if all of us around us are safe. It's something small countries have understood for a long time. You can't prevent, the only way you can keep yourself in peace is by helping to create peace around the world, which is why Scandinavian countries, Nordic countries, small countries have played such an important role in peace efforts. So that's one meaning of collective security. And the point is that nowadays we're all small countries. Nowadays we cannot any longer maintain security unilaterally. We live in such an interconnected world that we're only going to be safe if the world is safe. So that's one meaning of collective security. But secondly, I think we have to have a very holistic understanding of security. It's not just military threats that we're concerned about. We are deeply concerned about climate change, about what it might mean for the future of human beings. We're deeply concerned about the spread of pandemics and new diseases that we don't know about. We're deeply concerned about the consequences of extreme inequality and poverty. And we're also deeply concerned about the future of democracy, which, in my view, can't just be sustained only in one country, but needs favorable international conditions. So that's the second point. And then the third point is this is not just about the security of states. It's about the security of human beings. It's about the security of people. Immanuel Kant made the point in 1795 that a right violated in one part of the world is felt everywhere. It was extraordinarily prescient, but it's much more true today when we have social media, internet, when we actually are aware of terrible things and tragedies that are happening in other places. And when many of us live in transnational communities where we know people that live in that are related to people in other parts of the world. So what are our collective institutions? Well, NATO is an institution of collective security, and so is the United Nations, the European Union, the African Union, but they do collective security in different ways. NATO, if you like, is a geopolitical alliance. It's very much about security based on military strength, whereas the United Nations, the European Union, the African Union are much more about peace, and they do security through trying to negotiate peace agreements, something Norway's been really involved in, through peacekeeping, and so on. So my view is actually that we need something new that is different from both of these things, that is neither a military-based sort of security nor a purely peace-based, but is much more related to upholding international law, international justice, and global political legitimacy. I think there's a role for military force in this, but it's different again from either NATO or the UN and the EU. It's not war fighting, but nor is it classic peacekeeping. It's what people like to call hard security, but it's much more about being defensive and not offensive. I just discovered yesterday that I am a Holbergian. And that is because apparently Holberg believed that the only just wars were defensive wars. So you need military, the way to think about it is that military force is needed as a form of international law enforcement to deal with crimes of aggression, as in the case of Ukraine, crimes of genocide, as in the case of Palestine, and crimes against humanity, war crimes, all of these things. And it's more of a new kind of sort of defensive, protective military force. So I want to make two general points, and then I want to say a little bit about what it might mean for us in Europe now to have that kind of shift, because I think given the situation in America, given the war in Ukraine, we are in the midst of a big discussion about how we do security in Europe. And so I want to say a little bit about that. But I want to make two sort of preliminary points. One is that all military technology has become so lethal and accurate that it's very, very difficult to do what Thomas Schelling, the famous strategist, called compellence. It's very difficult to use military force to make someone do what you want them to do. Look at how difficult it's been for Russia to invade Ukraine. It can only advance at a few miles at a time, despite its overwhelming military preponderance. Whether you're talking about more or less symmetrical wars, which, if they escalate, they risk human extinction, and if they don't escalate, they lead to attrition, as in Ukraine or as in Iraq and Iran in the past. Or you can say the same is true of what we tend to call asymmetric wars, like Iraq and Afghanistan, where the kinds of military technology available to non-state actors, like improvised explosive devices or commercially bought drones, can be incredibly effective against sophisticated weapon systems. So I think the point I'm trying to make is that we tend to assume that money spent on defense translates into military power. This is not at all clear to me. We tend to assume that the United States has more military power than anyone else because of all those dollars that Boris was telling Americans spend on it. And yet, look at it. Has America won a single war since the end of the Second World War? What does that military power really mean? So that's one point I wanted to make, is about the limits of military power. And the second point I wanted to make is about the nature of contemporary geopolitics, which is what has greatly weakened the multilateral institutions like the United Nations, the European Union, and the African Union. I think the rise of the new geopolitics is very much associated with the rise of the authoritarian right. And that is associated to what's variously called oligarchy, crony capitalism, state capture, something that has emerged. I mean, it's always been there, but it's spread in the last few years, and I'd happily go into the causes, but I don't have time. But a sort of system where politicians try to gain power in order to make money as a source of income, and where they need money in order to win power. And so it's a kind of systemic form of corruption. It's a sort of kleptocracy, which is what we see in Moscow and increasingly now in the United States. And I think this new sort of geopolitics isn't geopolitics 101. It isn't the sort of geopolitics where the state pursues the interests of its people. It's a kind of new transactional oligarchic geopolitics where leaders are pursuing new opportunities for making money, for doing deals, and all of these kinds of things. And I think that can have very dangerous consequences, exacerbating the kind of political and criminal violence that we're seeing in large parts of Africa and the Middle East. And I just want to say about this that, it's worth remembering that I think we first saw this kind of oligarchy in the Balkans. If we want to try and understand people like Milosevic or Tudjman, they were very typical of this new type of authoritarian right in which they were into power to make money, but they framed their ideas very much in terms of extremist identity politics. And the consequence was to set in motion a kind of mixture of looting and making money through violence and extreme sectarianism. And this is what I really fear could be the consequence of this continued type of geopolitics. So now let me, having said a little bit about that, let me say something about what all this means for European security. Like Boris, I think we need to support Ukraine. And I think we need to strengthen also the conventional defense of the frontline states in NATO, the Baltic states, Poland, Finland. But I think we need to base it on defensive conventional defense. At the moment, NATO's strategy is based on deterrence, the idea that an attack on any part of the alliance would immediately trigger an offensive response, whether it's nuclear or conventional. We call it deterrence by punishment. And the problem with that is that it is inherently provocative. While, like Boris, I don't agree that the expansion of NATO was the reason why Putin invaded Ukraine, I think it did provide a powerful pretext. And I think that was our mistake. I think expanding NATO on the basis of NATO's current posture was actually inherently provocative and threatening. And so we provided that pretext. Whereas I think what we've learned from Ukraine is that we actually could have a very effective conventional defense. And if I had time, we could go into how these new technologies could really make that more possible. I mean, particularly what we've learned in recent years about drones and missiles and the vulnerability of large, expensive systems like tanks and aircraft. So that's part of the story. But I think more importantly, and this is where I'm going to disagree with Boris, I think what we need is what I've come to call, we could call it something else, democratic resilience. What we face in Europe, I think, is not so much a military threat, but a political threat from the far right. That is really what's frightening, and that political threat is being fanned both by Putin and by Trump, as we saw in the recent US national security strategy. And actually, if we look at Russian policy, I think the conventional attack on Ukraine in 2022 was almost an aberration. What the Russians talk about is what they call non-linear war. And what they mean by non-linear war is that it's really easy to reduce a country to chaos and disorder by using a combination of local dissidents, local separatists, what they call political technology, which is what they mean by disinformation, use of social media, and special forces. And that's, of course, what they did in the Donbass in 2014. And what we're seeing now in Europe is a real ramping up of these kinds of things, a ramping up of disinformation, of sabotage, of assassinations, of cyber attacks, which I think are very, very frightening. And I think the only thing we can do is to reduce our vulnerability to that. Now, I know here in the Nordic countries, you talk a lot about resilience, comprehensive resilience, and I agree with all that, but it usually has to do with things like preparedness, emergency services, infrastructure. What I think is absolutely critical, and that's in a way what the Ukrainians have shown us, is actually trust in our institutions. I think the problem in Europe is that we're actually very vulnerable to these political attacks. I think whether you're talking about Nigel Farage in Britain, the AfD in Germany, Marine Le Pen in France, they're vulnerable because of extreme inequalities, because of the way there's been an attempt to reduce welfare, because of the left behind, the people who lost out through globalization, because of increasing polarization, which has been fanned by anti-migrant rhetoric when we actually desperately need migrants in order to fill jobs. So I think that for me, democratic resilience is all about making us less vulnerable to these kinds of threats. It's not about being able to retaliate. It's not about being able to manage. It's about creating a kind of immunity. And that means doing all kinds of things, encouraging democratic participation, trying to overcome polarization in our society. And let me give you two examples of successful democratic resilience. When the separatists took over Luhansk and Donetsk in 2014, the Russians actually wanted that to happen over the whole of southern Ukraine, which Putin called Novorossiya. But in fact, it only succeeded in Donetsk and Luhansk with the help of Russian special forces. And in the rest of southern Ukraine, places like Odessa or Kherson, it was thwarted by ordinary citizens who felt they were Ukrainians even though they were Russian speakers. They'd experienced the Maidan, they'd experienced the Orange Revolution, and they were very committed to democracy. And it was they that thwarted these kinds of attacks. So, what I'm really saying is that a new kind of security paradigm would mean a shift from old-fashioned nuclear and offensive conventional deterrence to a mixture of conventional defense of territory and democratic resilience, but it also would need to be global, and it would need to involve a commitment to respect to international law. And I think the global is really important. What I find very shocking is the way that aid has been cut to finance increases in defense, whereas aid is absolutely critical to addressing conflicts all over the world, to addressing climate change, to addressing all the global threats to our security that exist at the moment. And it's really alarming that we have less capability to do that. Those conflicts in particular, which is what I study, do impact us. They impact us through refugees, they impact us through extremist ideologies, they impact us through transnational crime. And so it's a huge mistake to cut aid and cut our commitment to addressing those issues. So finally, what do I conclude? Can we bring about an alternative approach in this situation? I think it seems at the moment quite unlikely, unfortunately. And I fear that the rise of the far right, the rise of oligarchic geopolitics will actually reduce the space for the kind of discussion that we're having here that's absolutely necessary to address the problems that we face. And I think, the most likely scenario is actually the kind of Balkan scenario, which would involve a spread of political and criminal violence. In the past experimental junctures, there were always major wars. And in a way, winning the wars involved making a compromise with progressive groups. The problem now is we can't have a major war. If we did, it would lead to human extinction. And yet the alternative kind of war, which is the Balkan type of war, is really, really difficult to end. So is there anything that I feel hopeful about? Well, actually, the thing I feel most hopeful about is that I think global public opinion is on my side. I think if you look at the Ukraine wars and the Palestine wars, these are the most documented wars in history. People really care about war crimes and bringing people to account. If you look at the ICJ decision and the ICC decision, I think they're real breakthroughs in international justice. So there is a little bit of hope there, but I fear we may witness more tragedies before and if we get there.
Thank you very much indeed, Mary. And without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, I think having heard Mary wrestle with idealism and the world as it is today, realism, and then try at the end to find some hope, let us turn now to our last speaker, and with that word realism very much in mind, because Professor Stephen Walt, in his very distinguished academic career at Harvard University and other great American academic institutions as well, he's, in the course of his career, been described as one of the great sort of realist thinkers in terms of US foreign policy. So I think today, Stephen, we're going to learn more about what you mean when you sort of look at the world as it is today with a sense of realism. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, a warm welcome, please, for Professor Stephen Walt.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be back in Bergen, and I'm honored by the invitation and grateful to the organizers for including me in this. And having heard the first two presentations, I think I can assure you, you will get a somewhat different perspective from me. Is collective security dead? To answer this question properly, we have to define what we mean by the term. If collective security means a system in which all the major powers renounce using force to settle disputes and agree to unite to stop any country that violates this pledge, then it is not dead. For one simple reason, it was never alive. But if we define collective security as agreements intended to make war less likely, or to refer to military alliances where a subset of states join forces to deter and defeat a common threat, then history offers us many examples. Unfortunately, even these more modest forms of collective security are becoming less effective, which will make the world of the future more dangerous than the recent past. Here I agree with Mary. To make my case, I will first explain why the more ambitious approach to collective security has never worked, and then consider why the more modest versions are on life support today. The traditional version of collective security seeks to transcend all power politics by convincing states to settle their differences peacefully and to work together to stop any country that violates that principle. The League of Nations was the first serious effort to do this, and this also inspired the initial design of the United Nations. Not surprisingly, both of those efforts followed a catastrophic war, and both failed to achieve that goal. This version of collective security fails because it assumes dangerous aggressors are always easy to identify, and that all the other states will agree on who they are. It further assumes that all the major powers will be willing to act together to stop a powerful aggressor, which is costly and dangerous, even when their own interests may not be directly affected. Inevitably, some will be tempted to stand aside and let others deal with the problem. So in effect, this type of collective security not only assumes a near total consensus among major powers both now and far into the future, it assumes all conflicts of interest can be resolved peacefully. It depends on a level of trust and selflessness that is rare in international politics. Given those obstacles, it's hardly surprising that the League of Nations could not stop the slide of war into war in the 1930s, that the UN Security Council was hamstrung during the Cold War, or that it's frequently paralyzed by disagreements among the permanent members today. The list of failures here is quite long. The UN could not prevent recurring wars in the Middle East, stop the Soviet Union from invading Afghanistan, prevent genocides in Bangladesh, Rwanda, and most recently Gaza, halt the Balkan Wars in the 1990s before thousands of lives were lost, keep the United States from launching an illegal war in Iraq in 2003, or stop Russia from invading Ukraine in 2022. And given that track record, it is not surprising that Professor Innes Claude, one of the leading scholars studying how global institutions could try to prevent war, concluded near the very end of his career, quote, "The implementation of collective security theory is not a possibility to be taken seriously." All right, let me now turn to the more modest and realistic forms of collective security that have existed and explain why they're in trouble now. Well, one limited form of collective security is a security regime where rivals come together to limit their competition in narrow and specific ways. Arms control agreements like the START or SALT treaties are good examples, and some of those measures have, in fact, reduced the risk of war slightly. But these agreements did not stop the superpowers from building thousands of nuclear weapons or spending billions to make them more lethal, nor did they end the bitter rivalry between the Soviet Union and the West. Prospects for agreements of this kind are not bright today, in part because the number of states that must participate has grown significantly. The world is now multipolar, not bipolar, as it was during the Cold War, which means China would have to be included to make arms control among the great powers work. No effort is currently being made to hammer out an arms control agreement involving Moscow, Beijing, and Washington, and China is in fact not interested in limiting nuclear arms until it catches up with the other two. Instead, China and some other states are increasing their nuclear arsenals. Russia and the United States are modernizing their own forces in response, and several other countries are considering getting nuclear weapons of their own. Similar efforts to create guardrails around artificial intelligence or cyber weapons have gone nowhere, and getting all the relevant countries to agree on meaningful limits would be a formidable task. All right, a second limited form of collective security, and Mary referred to it as peacekeeping. Once two or more warring parties have agreed to make peace, neutral peacekeepers are deployed to monitor the agreement and reassure each side. But notice, this scheme only works if the groups that were previously at war genuinely want to stop fighting and they want to stick with that decision, because peacekeepers are usually too weak to stop a state or a warlord who decides to take up arms again. Peacekeeping is a useful tool, but it cannot stop war by itself. The final and the most effective form of collective security, more accurately described as collective defense, are military alliances. States facing a common threat can make themselves more secure by agreeing to help defend each other and by coordinating military responses to deter the threatening state from attacking or to defeat it if it does anyway. Alliances are most likely to form when a powerful and well-armed state is nearby and when it appears willing to use force to alter the status quo. In that situation, the threat posed by the aggressor will be clear to others and give them ample reason to unite against the danger. That logic, of course, explains why NATO formed in 1949, why the United States allied with countries in Asia during the Cold War, and why a large coalition came together to evict Iraq from Kuwait in the first Gulf War. The tendency for states to join forces against external threats can also be seen in the way that the United States and much of Europe rallied to support Ukraine after Russia invaded in February 2022. But it also explains why China and North Korea have given Russia considerable support as that war has dragged on. And the Ukraine case reminds us that collective defense arrangements do not always prevent war because deterrence sometimes fails. Collective defense agreements worked very well during the Cold War because it was clear to both sides that the use of force in Europe would lead to a vast and destructive war between two powerful alliances. And given that disastrous possibility, both sides wisely chose not to fight. Unfortunately, we cannot count on similar predictability and stability today because there is much less consensus on which states pose the greatest threats or how best to respond to them. In Europe, for example, some states see Russia as Boris depicted it, a relentless aggressor seeking to rebuild its former empire and dominate the European continent, while others do not share this alarmist view. Most states in the global south do not fear Russia and continue to do business with Moscow, and the Trump administration's position on Russia seems to change from week to week. I would also remind you that even though NATO still insists Ukraine will join it someday, no NATO members have been willing to send their own troops to fight and die for Ukraine. Moreover, American policymakers are increasingly convinced that Europe should be responsible for its own security so that the United States can focus on containing Chinese power in Asia. Europeans sometimes talk about playing a strategic role in the Indo-Pacific region, but no European country has the military capabilities to make a difference there, nor do they have a vital interest in doing so. What this means is that American and European strategic interests are gradually diverging, which will inevitably weaken NATO, even if the alliance remains formally intact. China's rising power and ambitions are apparent to countries in Asia and to the United States, but efforts to form a balancing coalition have been undermined by America's erratic policies towards the entire region, by the desire to stay friendly with China because of its importance to many economies, by rivalries among different Asian powers, and by each state's desire to get others to do the heavy lifting against China while they sit on the sidelines. The result is growing uncertainty about who will do what in a crisis, which makes miscalculation more likely. It's possible that the United States, Japan, Australia, and some others would come to Taiwan's aid in the event of a Chinese attack, for example, but it's also possible that some or all of them would decide to stand aside. In short, while there is a balancing coalition forming in Asia, it may not have sufficient coherence or credibility to deter China from making a bid for regional dominance. Finally, although states create alliances primarily in response to external challenges, these arrangements are stronger when they share similar values, and especially the core values of liberal democracy. Unfortunately, as has already been mentioned, the shared values that once united the West are evaporating. At the end of the Cold War, many people believed liberal democracy was the wave of the future. Instead, it has been in steady retreat for nearly 2 decades, as governments based on strongman rule, and yes, it's always men, have emerged in places like Russia, Hungary, Turkey, Egypt, India, and yes, even the United States. Britain has left the EU. Hungary and Slovakia oppose many of its principles, and as has already been mentioned, the U.S. national security strategy released last Friday makes it abundantly clear that the Trump administration is actively hostile to the EU's ruling principles and to many European governments. Moreover, Europe and the United States are divided over what to do in the Middle East. The United States gave Israel more than $22 billion of additional military assistance as it waged a genocidal campaign in Gaza. When the International Criminal Court indicted Prime Minister Netanyahu and Defense Minister Yoav Gallant on war crimes charges, along with several leaders of Hamas, the United States imposed sanctions on ICC officials. By contrast, a growing number of European states, including Norway and Great Britain, have formally recognized the state of Palestine. Some have pledged to hold Israeli officials accountable for war crimes. Where is the shared commitment to human rights or international justice in these different American and European responses? It is also revealing that Great Britain, which has long been America's closest ally and intelligence partner, recently suspended certain types of intelligence sharing with the United States because London did not want to be implicated in the Trump administration's illegal and murderous attacks on small boats in the Caribbean. A small matter, perhaps, but another sign of diminishing agreement on what actions are legitimate or consistent with core Western values. What I'm suggesting, in short, is that shared values are not going to strengthen alliances made for traditional balance of power reasons or help the member states overcome diverging strategic interests. The future of collective defense, in short, is not bright either. So what conclusions should you draw from this admittedly pessimistic analysis? Let me suggest 3. First, do not place your hopes for the future in the more ambitious form of collective security. It's never worked in the past. It won't work in the future. Second, we continue to live in a world where states have to rely on their own resources to survive and prosper, which is not to say they cannot improve their security by having reliable partners to help them deal with common dangers, including threats to the environment, pandemics, and things of that nature. It is the task of diplomacy to clarify what those dangers are and build a consensus on how to respond. This sort of diplomacy, alas, is in short supply at present. Third, strengthening one's capabilities and forming strong alliances does not preclude serious efforts to resolve existing conflicts, reduce tensions with rivals, or minimize specific risks, tasks best accomplished by having experienced and knowledgeable officials engage with one's adversaries in a disciplined and transparent way, rather than through backroom deals done by amateurs. But make no mistake, even the more limited forms of collective security I've described will not eliminate the risk of war or the need for states to prepare for that possibility. Collective security may not be dead, but it is certainly not in good health today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephen. All right, well, ladies and gentlemen, we've had our opening propositions from our 3 esteemed speakers, and I'm delighted to say that we now have the time and the space to just explore some of those ideas a little more, to dig a little deeper, and we're going to do that in terms of a conversation up here on the stage. I'm also delighted to say that Holberg opened up the idea of the debate to questions that were put from some of you people all around Bergen and beyond. Online, you were able to put forward questions of your own, and I've got some cards here with some extremely good questions, far better than the ones I'd thought of, which I'm going to weave into our discussion. So although we're not doing questions from the floor tonight, it is interactive in that, you know, I have these questions with me, and I'm delighted that they are going to give me plenty of ammunition as our conversation goes forward. I've really enjoyed listening to all three of you, and thank you so much for giving us your opening thoughts. And there's a lot to get through. You know, we've spent some time this evening very much focused on Ukraine and what the Ukraine war tells us about the state of collective security, particularly in the sense of the transatlantic alliance. And I think we'll start there. But I do, in the course of the next hour or so, want to rove wider than that. I want to talk about what we might learn from the Middle East and the conflict we've seen there raging over the last couple of years. I want to talk about the very broad brush sense that we're living in an age of sort of regional imperialism driven by the re-emergence of great powers, in a sense a sort of revisiting of the 19th century and a sort of balance of power in the world driven by dominant regional powers. And I want to talk about that because that clearly asks us questions in Europe of where we sit, because there's no doubt who the dominant powers are. I mean, it's the United States, it's China, and to a certain extent still, because of its nuclear arsenal, if nothing else, it's Russia. But where does Europe sit in that discussion of the great powers and their domination of the world? So as I say, and Mary alluded to the fact that, you know, we ought to think also about different ways in which collective security, collective action are going to be necessary if we across this planet are to address, you know, the universal challenge of climate change and what is going to be the universal challenge of a information and intelligence technology, which, as many of us now think about it, threatens, perhaps in the long term, to challenge our species' domination of the planet. So, you know, in that sense, there's a lot to talk about which goes far beyond the geopolitics of today. But let us begin with the West. The West as an idea, in a way, because I think what Donald Trump's latest national security strategy document suggests to us is that our assumptions about a transatlantic alliance, the West, and a collective approach to security driven by NATO, all of that, in essence, if not dead, is certainly on its deathbed. So let's begin there, and Boris, you begin, but I'm going to insist all of you keep it as pithy and as concise as you can. Did you read that Trump document, the national security strategy paper that's been put out by the White House, and did you feel a deep sense of alarm that the sort of assumptions you've carried with you throughout your political career no longer apply?
No, because I think this document has been a long time coming, and anybody who knows America and studies American politics will know that this is a strain in American thinking and has been for a century or more. America it's a huge continental power. They're by nature isolationist. That's how they think. As it happens,
not how they thought post 1945.
As it happens, having exhausted all available alternatives, as someone once said, the United States can be relied upon to do the right thing, and they've done it several times in the last 150 years, and I think the world is the better for it, and I think they will do the right thing again. Nor do I, by the way, believe that the West is dead. On the contrary, I look at China, India, these so-called rising powers. These are ancient centers of mass civilization with hundreds of people per square mile. The United States has fewer than 90 people per square mile, and it is a growing country. The growth in America is absolutely prodigious. Everybody wants Western culture. Who wants to listen to Russian techno-funk pop music? Who wants to watch Chinese movies? You talk about, somebody was earlier on talking about the influence of Putin in sub-Saharan Africa or Latin America, wherever it is. Who's interested in the cultural output of the autocracies? Who wants to send their kids to university in the authority. They want to come to Norway. They want to come to Britain. They want to come to the United States of America. The West is still the beacon for the world.
A fascinating proposition, and I love to hear your optimism about Europe. Let's talk about what Donald Trump sees as, quote unquote, the potential civilizational erasure of Europe. I'm not talking about a view from Beijing or from Moscow. I'm talking about a view from Washington right here, right now, which looks at Europe and says, this is a continent which is dying. It's dying demographically. It's dying because it won't defend its white Christian culture. It's open to immigration, which is undermining it from within. Its economy is stagnating and dying. It is a continent which is viewed from Washington right now as a continent that America doesn't need.
Well, look, I think there's a lot of hysteria in that analysis, and I think that actually wonderful things are happening in our European countries and cultures. I do think that the criticism that can be made of the whole European economic model is valid. And I know that some people here wish Britain had remained in the European Union. They're quite right Norwegians, which cares so much about that. I do not know. But since you're quite right to be out of it. But there, the US has a point. Look at the growth rates of the EU by comparison with the United States. And I think the point that paper is trying to make, and I'm not here to defend every jot and tittle of the White House document, but what it's basically saying is, in a nutshell, what I was trying to say earlier: cough up, you Euros, cough up. That's what it's saying. Right. It's saying yep. Unleash your economies, go for growth, and cough up for your defence.
In a sense, your message is, let's not take that document too seriously. Let's see a bigger picture and assume that
I think I know who wrote it. I'd love to hear what Stephen thinks about who wrote it. But I think I know who wrote it.
In just a sec, but Mary, somebody described it as America, in essence, filing for divorce from Europe. Did you see it that way?
No, I saw it as a great defence of all the far right in Europe. I saw it as support for the far right. That's how I understood it.
But where is the far right in power in Europe? Where?
Hungary.
Oh, God, okay.
Italy.
I mean, why are you throwing her out? I mean, she's absolutely right. It is in power.
Is Meloni really far right?
Yeah, except on Ukraine. Well, maybe except on Ukraine, yeah. On migrants, on all these other issues, yeah.
But the point the document made is that Donald Trump and his administration are explicit in their desire to do everything they can going forward to help those parties, which would include Marine Le Pen's, would include the AfD and others across Europe, to fight for them and to try and help them get into power if they're not already in power, because in Trump's worldview at the moment, those are the only legitimate forces left in Europe.
Look, I want to get away from thinking about the West and the West being so wonderful. Because after all, the West hasn't been wonderful. The West was colonialist, the West intervened in Iraq and Afghanistan, and there's a reason that the global South are ambivalent about Ukraine, which is that they see this as another Western adventure. I don't agree with them, but I just don't think we should think the West is so great at this point. Moreover, I think there's always been tension between the United States and Europe over security issues. Some of you may remember a book a few years ago called America is from Mars and Europe is from Venus. And, you know, the European Union was established as a peace project. It was very influenced, I think, by the movements of the 1980s, both the peace movements and the human rights movements. And so its ideas of security were very much based on human security. It was very much about trying to resolve conflicts. It was not so much about classic geopolitical alliances. So there's always been that kind of difference. And since I see myself as a European, despite Brexit, I I have actually become a Hungarian citizen.
Yeah. Well, in spite of your aversion to Hungary,
I'm half Hungarian. I'm half Hungarian. It's my only aversion to Orban, to Viktor Orban, who actually used to be my student, but that's another story.
Oh.
You can vote
now the whole thing becomes.
But I can now.
I was hearing you go on about the West. drove him to the extreme.
This is utterly fascinating, but may slightly divert us from the topic at hand.
Take it.
We may revisit your relationship with Viktor Orban in the classroom, but for the moment...
No, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have brought it up.
No, believe me, people are going to remember that for a long time. But Stephen, I want your thought. I was just jotting down during your presentation, thoughts that you had that the US and Europe's strategic interests are diverging. You also indicated that in terms of values, the way they see the world, there is also a deepening divergence. So what's your thought on the real significance of this new national security strategy issued by the White House? How seriously should we take it? Are we at one of these watershed moments that forces us to question assumptions we've held for 8 decades?
Yeah, I think we are, and I agree with Mary that there are many forces at work that suggest this is one of these moments future historians will look back on as a critical decade for a variety of reasons. I mean, it's always impossible for us to know how significant these national security documents are. They are not action plans per se. Presidents frequently ignore them. They are sometimes overtaken by events, and so they get shunted aside. I think it's most revealing, perhaps, is what it says about the worldview of the people who drafted it, and presumably with the approval of the president. And that, in that sense, it's quite important. In some respects, this one, which differs from a lot of its predecessors, is a little bit more like the one that was written in 2002, right after September 11th, and laid out sort of the blueprint for the global war on terror. I do think it's revealing, and as I suggested in my remarks, it's not the first time that Americans have pushed the Europeans in various ways to spend more on defense. We've been doing that ever since Eisenhower, sometimes successfully, sometimes less so. But they were going further. It's an interesting document in another way. It talks about how the United States is going to pull back from this interventionist mindset, this impulse to be evangelical and run around the world telling other countries how to run their own affairs, except for one part of the world, Europe. We are going to actively intervene to try and strengthen the parties we like, and these are the far right, in Europe, the forces that are aligned with the MAGA movement in Europe. We're going to intervene in Europe, which is quite interesting. Not in the Middle East. They can run their own affairs. Not in Russia, not in China, not in Latin America. Venezuela, right. The other place they're willing to intervene. So Europe is now, think of itself as a gentler, a kinder, gentler version of Venezuela in the eyes of America. That's probably overstating it a little bit as well. One just other point about this, and that the Trump administration doesn't like the European Union. Donald Trump has not liked it for decades. He thinks the European Union was created, in his words, to screw the United States, right? He's occasionally called the European Union an enemy, right? And there's, I think, a simple economic logic to this. When the United States has to bargain with the European Union as a unified group, it's dealing not necessarily with an equal, used to be more equal, but it's dealing with a peer that it has to take seriously. When it gets to deal with individual European countries, on the other hand, in economic terms, then the United States is huge, has much more leverage, much more compelling ability in those kinds of talks. So from his point of view, given that he's basically a mercantilist at heart, he would like to deal with all other countries in the world on a bilateral basis. And if the European Union ceased to exist, and he could deal bilaterally with Norway, with Belgium, with France, with Germany, with Italy, that would strengthen his position. Right, so this is, in some respects, a document that wants to strengthen anti-EU forces within Europe, because in his mind, that creates a situation where the United States has lots of advantages as well. Last point. The European Union, if you go back to the 1950s and look at the origins, it was not entirely a peace project. That's part of it. No question. But the other part of it was that in the early 1950s, everyone believed that the United States was eventually going to leave Europe. right? And that Europe was going to have to defend itself against the mighty Soviet Union, and the individual European economies couldn't assemble enough military power unless they began to unify their economies, had a common market, things like that. It was intended in part to provide the economic wherewithal to mount a serious collective defense against the Soviet Union. Other things contributed to its growth over time. It took on lots of other purposes. And note, the United States never left. So the Europeans never had to build the kind of military power they were initially. Now, I mention all of that only because if the European Union falls apart, it's going to be much more difficult for Europe as a whole to assemble the kind of economic capabilities to do the sorts of things that Boris and others were recommending earlier.
Well, Stephen, thank you. Now, look, you guys, you all talk beautifully, but I'm going to be brutal and say you've got to talk shorter because we've got a lot to get through. So be concise and pithy, because I'm now going to introduce some questions that have come in from our audience here in Bergen. And I'm introducing them as we get through particular topics and themes. So these are all broadly themed on what Europe needs to address right now in terms of ensuring as best it can its security. One question goes like this. Do you see Europe's push for quote-unquote strategic autonomy, which is a phrase I think Emmanuel Macron in particular has used, talking about the degree to which, looking at what's happening in the United States, Europe has to develop a much more meaningful, independent European security capability. Strategic autonomy, he calls it. Is that the pathway towards a more balanced world order? i.e., is Europe capable of strategic autonomy? And what would it mean for global geopolitics if Europe was that independent security power? All of you, short, concise answers. Mary first.
Yes, but I didn't manage to finish my last answer.
Oh, well, too late. It's a brutal world out there, Mary, and that's gone. So you've got to get on with the next.
Okay, well, now I'm going to make it, though, because, yes, I do think Europe needs strategic autonomy, and I've always have. I don't think we necessarily want to be tied to US military policy. When Donald Trump asks us to cough up more, what he wants is for us to buy American weapons. And I'm not sure that American weapons is the way to go. What we've failed to have in Europe is a real debate. Yes, we need stronger conventional defenses, but, you know, did the extended nuclear deterrent ever protect us? Both Kissinger and Schlesinger said it's not credible that the US would risk the lives of millions of Americans to save Europe. But we believed it did. And so I think we really need we need strategic autonomy, but we also need a real public debate, like the one we're having here, actually, about what it is that we're coughing up for. Are we going to just spend the money on hugely expensive systems that can be blown up by a Ukrainian commercial drone? What are we going to spend the money on?
Right. Well, that's a fair question. By the way, do you put NATO in the bin if you develop an autonomous European military structure?
I would like NATO to shift the way it does security, and I wouldn't put it in the bin if it could. It just depends on whether the US would go along with it.
All right, you next, Boris, but keep it.
Why did the European Union expand in the 1990s and 2000s? Because the Western-led NATO alliance, an American-led NATO alliance, defeated the Soviet Union in the Cold War by outspending them massively on high frontier and other projects. Communism was shown to be a completely bankrupt creed, and the Eastern European countries wanted to join the West. And that was because of American military leadership. And I agree with you, it's an incredible thing that America remains committed to Europe in the way that it does. And long may that go on, because I look at Europe and there is still no answer Trump is really just making the same point as Henry Kissinger. Who do you ring if you want to talk to Europe? That's what Americans have been saying for 50 years, and they're right.
It was civil society that overthrew communism, not...
You haven't really addressed my question about European strategic autonomy, whether you're a believer in it.
European strategic autonomy is like what Gandhi said about Western civilization. It would be a good thing, right? But it's at the current rate of fire, it is never going to happen. in the absence of our ability to get our act together fast enough to protect ourselves against the challenge of Putin and other threats, I think having a strong American presence, having American hegemony, let's call it for what it is a good thing.
In a funny sort of way,
it's helped to keep
Donald Trump or his team were listening to you now, they just say, there you go, Boris, you're just constantly turning it back to a reliance on the United States. Get over it. You know, cut your umbilical cord to us.
But that's not what they're saying. They're saying the EU model is broken, fix it, grow your economies and be proper partners. That's what they're saying. And that's an entirely reasonable thing to say.
Stephen.
Yeah, I think European strategic autonomy is a good idea, and I think the United States is making it much more likely to occur by the actions it's taking, by basically conveying that the United States is no longer reliable. When European strategic autonomy has come up in the past, in the 1990s and in the aughts, the United States was dead set against it. All European security planning had to be done in the context of NATO, because the United States ran NATO. It was a tool as much as anything for American retaining influence in Europe. If the United States is no longer interested in doing that, or only wants to do it in a very unilateral fashion, that's going to be, I think, the second largest impulse for European strategic autonomy. Europeans do have a choice. They can remain essentially strategically dependent on the United States and be forced to follow American whims whichever way they go. And by the way, it also decreases your leverage in economic ties, as we've seen in the last year or so. But in other words, it's a good idea, and we are making it more likely to happen.
But it's rubbish, because it may be a good idea, but it's not going to happen. And there's a very simple reason. All military alliances depend on a hegemonic power from the Athenian Empire onwards, right? And America is no exception. In Europe, in our great continent, which would be, in the absence of the United States, the hegemon? Is it going to be France? Is it going to be Germany?
There was no hegemonic power that defeated Napoleon.
Is it going to be Britain?
It was Russia, Britain, Austria-Hungary, and eventually Prussia.
I saw a Danish gentleman on the telly. Well, actually, it was on social media, so it may have been fake. I don't know. But anyway, I appear to have seen a Danish gentleman on telly just a few hours ago talking about the need for the European Union to acquire not just strategic autonomy, but its own nuclear weapons capability.
To be deployed on what democratic principles by, and who's got their finger on the button? Ursula von der Leyen. I mean, donnez-moi un break, folks. This is
Look, I agree with the Danish guy, except about the nuclear bit. And I think, yes, the European Union has to go further politically. It has to go, it has to make, it has too many presidents. It has to democratize further, and then it really needs to act. And you know, I think the European Union is a kind of new kind of power in the world. It's not a classic great power, but nor is it an international institution. It's a new kind of power, and it's kind of pioneering, I think, or it could, a new sort of model in which we get rid of the worst aspects of the nation state while preserving the nation state. That's what I feel the European Union is able to do, but it needs to...
Mary, that's an interesting idea. As you were expounding upon it, Mr. over here was rolling his eyes, which I...
Well, you were rolling your eyes.
No, I wasn't rolling my eyes. I was rolling my eyes at you rolling your eyes.
Okay, well, I was just following your cue. Well, I think that the idea that we can abolish the nation state and subsume ourselves into some greater European project, you know, it's possibly a noble idea, but I just don't think it's what people instinctively want to do.
Okay.
And it's not what everybody in the United States, all these liberals in the United States who preach at us, saying that you know, Britain should get back into all the Democrats. And you know, come on, would the United States ever share sovereignty with any other country over anything? The US isn't even subscribed to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, the rights of the child, nothing. You don't, as you just pointed out, the US doesn't sign up to any international court. Under Obama, Biden, doesn't matter.
Listen, I've got one specific question for you, Boris, but I'm only going to put it to you if you promise to answer it in less than 1 minute.
Yes.
Go. You're good. Because a very polite Norwegian here in Bergen has asked, and this is specifically for Boris Johnson, I wonder if you regret Brexit.
No, I love Brexit.
Hang on, given the need...
I love Brexit with a growing passion.
I wonder if you regret Brexit given the need right now for strong collective security in Europe.
Can I tell you something about the way Europe handled Ukraine? When that thing happened, and it started in 2014, right? And the Ukraine dossier was held by France and Germany. And Britain was edged out because the Germans wanted Steinmeier, who was then the foreign minister of Germany, now the president, and the French socialists wanted to run the policy themselves because they fundamentally had their view of Russia, which was at variance with the UK view. And they thought that they could do a deal with Putin. They thought that they could sit down with the Ukrainians like marriage guidance counselors and the Russians and try and fix it. And it was a total sham. You remember the Normandy process, the Minsk agreements, all that nonsense? France, Germany, and I was foreign secretary when some of this was going on. The UK was frozen out of these conversations right from 2014 onwards, long before Brexit. And it was actually only thanks to Brexit that we were able to take a different view on Ukraine and to differ from our European friends and partners. And we were the first to send serious lethal weaponry in the form of the anti-tank missiles. That would never have happened under the common European foreign policy. I'm also very proud, by the way, that out of the EU, we were able to vaccinate our population far faster than any other European country because we weren't in this thing called the European Medicines Agency. So we approved the vaccines about 5 weeks before anybody else. And that saved people's lives. Brexit saved lives. It did. When elderly people,
hang on.
elderly
I said
people
1
were
minute.
terrified.
I
didn't care.
You're way over your 1 minute.
Oh, I'm
Steve,
sorry, I
you were
forgot.
smiling softly through much of that.
I was smiling softly because although the former Prime Minister does not regret his decision, most of his countrymen do. If you look at public opinion polls now, 63% or more, and it goes up every 6 months, now believe the Brexit vote was a mistake. Moreover, if you want,
try putting it back to the people.
Google Stanford University economics study Brexit consequences. You'll get a recent paper by 4 economists there showing what the economic effects of Brexit have been. A disaster for Britain, lowering its growth rate, lowering its investment rate, etc.
Which country has grown faster?
Exactly as the
Which country has grown faster?
Exactly. It was growing faster than the rest of Europe before Brexit. It's been growing slower ever since.
Sorry,
Congratulations, Prime Minister.
Last time I looked, both Germany and France. Last time I looked, both Germany and France were members of the European Union, and we've grown faster than both of them since 2016.
Not a high bar to clear, and that's not all of Europe.
They are members.
Hang on. Shouting down opponents is okay in the UK House of Commons, but it's not okay on the stage here in Bergen. So cut out all of this parliamentary behaviour.
And can I say something about Brexit too?
Yes, Mary, yes.
Because I think it not only was a disaster for our economy, but it's also been really bad for foreign policy. Because I think Britain played a very important role in EU foreign policy, and I think we're seeing it in the Horn, where Britain was very active and brought in the UN, brought in the EU, and I don't think we'd have had this disaster in Sudan. Similarly, I think it was also true in Afghanistan that I actually think Britain would have changed the conditions of the withdrawal if they felt that the EU was with them and could have acted in a more autonomous way, independent of the US. We would have had a different, not this mad rush to leave and allow the Taliban to take over. Your defense secretary was in tears about it all. And so I actually think Brexit is not only a disaster in economic terms, it's also a disaster in political terms, and it's also a disaster in foreign policy terms.
Well, all right, I want to just sort of draw a line right there. We've discussed Europe at some length. I just want now to have us think big picture about where geopolitics is going in terms of the impulses behind it. I mean, what we see in Washington right now is an extraordinarily explicit transactional approach to foreign affairs. What's in it for me? in essence, without moral judgments, without moral values, without any talk of crusades to spread freedom and democracy around the world. And in that view of transactional international affairs, it doesn't really matter whether Vladimir Putin is a violent authoritarian who kills his opponents. It doesn't really matter whether Beijing conducts, quasi-genocidal policies in the Uyghur region of Xinjiang. None of that matters. You don't judge it. You don't care about it. What you care about is the quality of the transaction and what you can get out of it. Is that, as we're talking big picture about collective security in the world, is that what is going to drive the world from here on in? Are we in the age of the triumph of transactionalism?
Well, we always have been. Can I just
have we?
Yeah, but can I just quickly come back to what Mary was saying about Afghanistan, because of all the nonsense that's honestly, the reason for the catastrophic events in Afghanistan was entirely because the Biden administration decided to pull out far faster than anybody thought that they were going to. It was nothing to do with the EU or the UK.
No, but I think the EU could have decided to...
Well, hang on. I mean, the original decision to pull out was Trump's before Biden came into power. So that's
the way it was done was entirely.
Look, I don't want to get stuck on that.
Listen,
I just to turn a page.
On your point about transactionalism.
Yeah.
On your point about transactionalism, let me ask you seriously. Everybody now says that we're living in this new nightmare era of strong men, and Trump has been likened by Stephen over here to Putin, other strong men, autocrats around the world. This is absolute rubbish. This guy was democratically elected. He will leave office in 3 years' time. He fought for every vote over the last 4 years. And on internationalism...
He launched a half-baked coup, by the way.
Which country, which president actually gave the Ukrainians shoulder-launched anti-tank weapons in, I think, 2017?
Or possibly later.
What we did, yes, in the UK, but it was Trump rather than Obama who led the way. And which president actually put serious tariffs on countries using Russian hydrocarbons? It was Trump. And there is a sort of left liberal hysteria and a desire to equivocate or to make a moral equivalence between Trump and Putin, or Trump and Xi Jinping, or whatever, which is absolutely insane. Whatever you say about Trump...
You've had a good say so far, so let's hear from Mary and Stephen.
Yeah, well, on the transactional, I think it points it out clearer than the 28 points that Trump and, what was he called, Dmitry Peskov or whatever, drew up, Krylov drew up. Yeah. And the only really detailed point is how they're going to use the frozen assets and how it's going to be shared out between Russia and the US. And that is a very, very good example of transactional geopolitics. And I think everything you say, Stephen, I completely agree with. I think we are moving towards much more transactional geopolitics, where what matters is the money that you make out of the deal, and issues of norms, who's allowed to have territory, are you allowed to take territory illegal, issues of international law get more and more ignored, and this is just incredibly dangerous. And that's why I think for Europeans it's so important that we stick to our principled. It's so important, and it's why I think the EU as a sort of institution is so important, because it is about upholding international norms. It is about understanding that there are limits, actually, to sovereignty. Limits which have to do with violence, which have to do with domestic repression, and all of that kind of thing. So, yes, I totally agree with you. I think this shift to transactional geopolitics is very dangerous, and that's why I strongly support the idea of the European Union pushing an alternative kind of security policy.
Right. Stephen, I'm interested in your response to this because in a funny sort of way, your realism when you analyze international affairs sort of fits quite neatly with a notional that in the end it is all about, you know, what can I get out of a deal or a relationship or a commitment to another country's, you know, trade relations or whatever. Are you in, you know, is this like just stripping away all the bullshit, to use my language, and just getting real about the way international affairs has always worked?
I'm glad you asked, because again, realists are not surprised when they see countries doing bad things and competing for power and competing for influence. But realists, particularly sophisticated realists, also understand that norms and rules are essential. As long as states are interacting with each other, they need rules to govern that. You can't fly an airplane from one country to another now without the fact that there's an international air travel convention that regulates air travel. Right? So we have all the things we do with other countries involve rules and norms. And by the way, because we do aspire to having a better world, we try to institute some rules on human rights behavior, on regulating warfare and things like that, even though we're competing. The danger of short-term transactionalism, of course, of being one of those countries that's just out for whatever short-term gain I can get, constantly predation, is first of all, you alarm other countries and they start acting against you in various ways. They also just stop trusting you. They won't cooperate with you if every deal you make this week can be changed next week. This is ultimately why Trump's economic policies are not going to work particularly well, because unless he's willing to stick to some of the deals that he negotiates, which so far he hasn't been willing to do, other countries will eventually realize that there's no point in trying to accommodate the guy. He'll just rewrite the rules later. All right, so even for a hard-nosed realist, you need some norms, you need some rules, and you have to follow them most of the time. Otherwise, you're worse off, and so is everybody else.
Mm. Okay, I want to ask you all about international law and what it means today and what it might mean in the future. It seems to me, you know, we've been dealing in the last couple of years with two enormous, horrifying conflicts, one in Ukraine, one in Gaza involving Israel-Palestine. And in a funny sort of way, it confuses me how people can't see that there is one commonality there, which is, you know, there is an occupying power which contravenes international law and which the international community, if it's serious about international law, should confront. And yet many people find ways to apply international law in the one case and not in the other. And I'm confused by that. Does that mean, and can we learn from the last couple of years and those two terrifying conflicts that, frankly, international law, though we might all want to believe in it, it doesn't really mean very much in the world we actually live in?
I actually disagree, and I think international law has become more important. It doesn't mean that it's implemented, but it means that people are taking it very much more seriously. I think in historical terms, the decision by the ICJ on the case...
International Court of Justice.
The International Court of Justice on the case brought by South Africa, that this could be a genocide.
The case of genocide, yeah.
Was hugely significant. Similarly, the ICC indictment of Netanyahu as well as Hamas was hugely significant, because the problem up till now is that the Global South have really seen international law as an instrument of the West, which doesn't apply to Western leaders. So Blair and Bush were never indicted for invading Iraq, which was a clear act of aggression. So the only kind of criminal cases that were brought to the ICC were definitely criminals in Africa, and people liked that. People were positive about the International Criminal Court, but they felt it suffered from double standards. So I think what happened over the last year with the ICJ and the ICC is incredibly important. I also would like to say something about international law, because it's something I think is terribly important, that I feel the war on terror has done terrible things in terms of reducing the constraints on international law. The decision that you could go to war with non-state actors, that self-defense applies to non-state actors, and then the idea that terrorists were counted as combatants and you could kill them, and you could kill them anywhere in the world, has led us to a situation where Israel can justify killing people, Hamas people at home with their families because they're combatants, and this is the easiest place to kill them, which was never part of international law, targeted as, or the pages that were used against to kill Hezbollah. International law was targeted assassination was always a taboo. You didn't kill an enemy general on the street. You might kill them on the battlefield, but that was something very different.
No, okay, so you've made that passionate case for the continued importance of international law. Boris, I want to turn this on you. You are the only one of us sitting on this stage who's been a prime minister, right? So you've experienced having to handle power and incredibly difficult decisions in a way that none of the rest of us have. And Britain, let us remind ourselves, is a signatory to the ICC and the ICJ. So if you were Prime Minister, you would, through the Gaza war of late, you would have had to face a decision. If Benjamin Netanyahu, for example, were to land on UK territory, you as Prime Minister would have had to have decided whether to order his arrest. You have been a long-time supporter of Israel, indeed through the war. So what would you have done?
Well, look, nobody should minimize the suffering of the people of Gaza and the tragedy of what's happened over the last couple of years since October the 7th, 2023. And it's been appalling. But if I'd been, suppose I'd been Prime Minister when the UK had suffered an attack on the scale of October the 7th. So pro rata, that would have been about 8,000 or 9,000 people killed, raped, tortured, their screams audible to the entire population. Everybody would have understood what had happened in the most graphic, gory detail. It would have been absolutely democratically impossible for any Prime Minister, and I appreciate this, maybe what I'm about to say may be very unpopular, but I'll just be clear with you. It would be impossible for any democratically elected Prime Minister not to take steps to find those responsible and to make it impossible for them to do any such thing ever again. And the problem with Hamas is that they have at no stage renounced their desire not just to wipe Israel off the map, but actually to kill every Jew in Israel and to kill every Jewish person in the world. And I'm sorry, but it is very, very difficult for Israel to coexist with an organization, a government that has that ambition. And yes, that is why I'm afraid I do have sympathy for Israel. I certainly do.
I mean, I think what you've just said is all very interesting, but it has nothing to do with the question I asked you. The question I asked you is very specific, because right now we're not talking about the rights and wrongs of the Israel-Palestine conflict. We're talking about what international law means in this world of ours today. I asked you a very specific question. As the UK is a signatory to these international treaties which created the ICJ and the ICC, you as Prime Minister, would you have authorized the arrest of a man, Benjamin Netanyahu? You would not.
No, I would not.
So you would have laughed in the face of the UK's treaty commitments to uphold international law.
No, because I think it was a perverse judgment in the face of...
But it's not your right to decide whether... You can't, in any legal situation, if somebody is charged, you can't say, oh, well, that particular charge is ridiculous, so I refuse to recognize the court and I'm not going to appear in court as charged. You don't have the right to do that. That's not the way the law works. It's not for you to choose.
Actually,
you either believe in international law, the system, or you don't.
No, you can dissent from judgments of the international.
You've signed a treaty.
And for instance, we were under an obligation, I seem to remember, to arrest General Pinochet when he came to London many years ago, but we didn't do that because we dissented from that opinion. We dissent from the opinion of the court about the Chagos Islands, for instance. I certainly do. I think it would have been totally wrong to turn on an ally of this country when they had faced suffered a most appalling attack, and when the organization that did it, in my view, has a complete, people effectively are supporting Hamas.
The whole point of a court of law is to come to a reasoned legal conclusion. It's not for you to preempt the decision of the court that you've signed up to. Otherwise, you are basically telling me international law means nothing.
No, I think that it's absolutely true that it's a very difficult concept, because we don't have a democratic way of holding these judges to account. They're appointed by obscure systems, and very often with a great deal of political influence. And that is, if you look at what's happening to the appointments of judges in these courts, I'm afraid a lot of it is being led now by the Chinese. And I have my doubts about it.
All right, Boris, I'm going to stop you if I may. I think you've had a fair whack and you've made your position clear. Stephen, I just want your view on this before we move on. Just on this idea of whether international law and the mechanics of international law actually mean anything in the world.
So the chief weakness in international law is the lack of an enforcement capacity. There is no sheriff to go off and arrest these people. There's no police force at an international level, and that's because states have never wanted such an institution with those kind of powers to exist. So in that sense, international law can't get states to do things that they don't want to do, which is why Boris could get away with defying the International Criminal Court if he wished as prime minister. Now, the fact that Israel suffered an attack meant that they were certainly entitled to respond. The indictments were saying that the response was completely inappropriate, completely disproportionate, and might have constituted a genocide. So you can be infinitely sympathetic to what happened to Israel on October 7th and not justify what they did subsequently, and in fact believe that the people responsible for that are guilty of a genocide. Finally, at the very end, we got to a very important point here. International law is mostly determined by major powers, right? The balance of power in the world is changing. China is a risen power now from where it was 30 years ago, and it has various ideas about how international law ought to be different. Now, human rights law ought to be different. It likes some aspects of international law and institutions. It doesn't like some other ones. And it is pressing very hard in a variety of different ways to try and shift the way international law is implemented and interpreted. And this matters for the reasons I explained earlier about which violations attract attention, which violations damage a reputation. When the West acts in a hypocritical fashion and posits a bunch of pious proclamations which it ignores whenever they are inconvenient, we are making it easier for other countries who have different conceptions of international law to point the finger and say, you don't want to follow those rules because they don't even follow them themselves. You should prefer our set of rules because we'll be happy to live by them. That may be self-serving, it may not be true, but we're making it easier for others to challenge the kinds of norms we've established.
All right, very briefly, Mary.
Yes, very briefly. I want to make 2 points. I mean, one is that I think things change. I mean, Steve's points are somehow that states are always the most powerful, but actually we have slowly built up an international machinery, and the establishment both of the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court, I think, were huge breakthroughs in international arrangements. It may be that we're not yet taking them seriously, but we're beginning to take them seriously, and public opinion is taking them seriously. The other point I wanted to make was, what would it mean in terms of the alternative security paradigm I was talking about if you had something like Hamas? It's very similar to the 9/11. I mean, I think that if Israel had gone to the United Nations and said, we've suffered the most terrible crime against humanity, will you help us, including with military force, to find those responsible and arrest them, Israel would have had total international support. It would have been a very different situation, and it might have led to a better situation in the end. I mean, if you think about what's happened, I think both Israel and Jews worldwide are less safe as a consequence of this war.
Are we happy to move on to another topic? I think that was a fascinating debate, and I thank you for it, but I want to move now onto a slightly different area, although, Stephen, your last answer sort of led me in the direction I wanted to go anyway. It just seems to me that, and various times you've all alluded to this in the debate, what we are looking at now is a world of regional empires. You know, we very explicitly saw that White House document talk about a revival of the Monroe Doctrine and the notion that the United States regards the entire Western Hemisphere, which, you know, worryingly for Denmark, appears to include Greenland. The entire Western Hemisphere is its backyard, and it has a right and will exploit that right to the full to dominate and influence everything that happens in its backyard. At the same time, there is something implicit, if not explicit, in Trump's worldview, which says, you know what, China is a great big power, and ultimately we don't want them to take Taiwan, and we'll, you know, tell them that they shouldn't take Taiwan, but frankly, I'm kind of reading between the lines that if in the long run they do take Taiwan, well, it's sort of recognition that they've got a backyard too, and we kind of understand that. And certainly when it comes to Putin, I mean, Trump clearly seems to believe in some sort of Ruski Mir, Nova Russia, whatever. He seems to understand that Russia has a right to a big sphere of influence across its western frontier in Eastern Europe. He seems to sort of think that's reasonable. If we are now living then in a world of these sort of regional quasi-empires, is that in itself a form of stability? Can that last? Can that be a way of avoiding world war? What do we think of a world which is based on these dominant spheres of regional power, you know, with their homes in Washington, Beijing, Moscow? And then, of course, where would Europe fit into that? And would Europe be deeply vulnerable, or would Europe have its own space?
So yes, you can give a theory of sort of a great power concert where if you put them all in separate rooms and let them run their particular spheres, as long as they all agree to remain within those spheres, I can sketch you a nice theoretical picture where that, from the point of view of great power conflict, is preferable. It may not be so wonderful for some of the subordinate parts within those spheres, right? Obviously, and that would apply to all three of the countries we're talking about here. The difficulty is maintaining that over time is going to be very easy or very difficult, because first of all, Asia is still up for grabs. Not entirely clear that China is going to dominate Asia, and I think the administration is divided about how significantly. So that's a very significant flashpoint there. I would guess the United States actually continues to contest an effort for China to establish a sphere of influence in Asia. But even if that sphere were established, what happens if China then starts trading with countries in the Western Hemisphere that want to trade with China? Do we start to push back? The national security strategy just released suggests that we would in those circumstances. Do we start contesting over influence in South Asia? Who's going to have the predominant influence in the Middle East? What about Africa? The national security strategy is very dismissive of Africa, but is that likely to last forever? Right? So you can paint a nice picture for how spheres of influence might work, but I don't think they eliminate great power competition, and in fact, it just means they'll end up in other areas as well.
Well, I don't think it's not just about great power competition. It's also about all the other things that are happening. I mean, I think it's far harder to maintain control over spheres of influence than it ever was in the past, because you don't have superiority in military technology, because we have inequalities, because we have misinformation. And so I think that the attempt to impose spheres of influence is almost inevitably going to lead to greater violence, whether it's political or criminal or gangster violence, unless you organize regions differently. And that is quite interesting. I mean, the European Union is probably the most developed of the regional organizations, but the Latin Americans have their Court of Human Rights. The African Union it's rather ineffective at the moment, but there's a range of regional multilateral institutions. All of these have been greatly weakened in an era of transactional geopolitics. But that doesn't, I think we're in a very tumultuous period, and if we want to get out of it in a way that strengthens multilateralism, then regional arrangements may be the way to go. We haven't talked about economics or all the other things that are going wrong at all, and I think that has so much to do with it. I think the rise of transactional geopolitics is really the consequence of years of market fundamentalism, and I think we need a new set of economic arrangements if we're ever going to get out of this terrifying moment. And we can't have a new set of economic arrangements unless they're global, unless they involve the international financial institutions, unless they involve both China and the United States, which is why thinking about alternative collective security is so incredibly important.
Boris?
Well, I don't think that... What's the question that the United States has withdrawn from...
The question is, if we are now living in a world which appears to be moving more towards sort of the great powers, which we've been discussing at the moment as being US, China...
Spheres of influence.
Yeah, and whether that could be a stable state of affairs for the world for the long term, or whether it's inherently...
No. Well, so I fundamentally don't agree with the idea that America has withdrawn in some way from its interest in the rest of the world. And, whatever you say about Donald Trump's campaign for a Nobel Peace Prize, he claims to have resolved, and he must have devoted at least some bandwidth to solving conflicts.
With the greatest respect, he said he'd made peace between Albania and Armenia. He didn't even know the names of the countries that he thought he'd made peace between.
Azerbaijan, actually. But look, he at least had them into his office, and he spent a lot of time, some time, trying to speak. DRC and Rwanda, Pakistan and India, where he definitely spent some time personally, Cambodia and Thailand.
Yeah, by the way, they're fighting each other again.
Sure.
That's not...
But all I'm saying is that the US is engaged around the world, and I think that is fundamentally a good thing. And look, I honestly, much as I respect and admire the EU, I do not, to which Mary is clearly devoted, I really don't think that it is the answer to global security. And I've got to tell you that I think that our best bet as Western Europeans is to protect that Atlantic alliance. It's been the most effective guarantor of our safety for a very, very long time. It works. It's worked extremely well. I believe the US, whatever you say, is still committed to it.
You sound like the jilted lover who keeps going back to the ex's house, knocking on the door and saying, "It's not over, please let me back in, we can make this work."
But where's the evidence? But I keep asking you, where's the evidence that the United States has really turned its back on Europe? They're still in NATO, they're still paying considerable, they've still got huge numbers of American troops in Europe. As I've told you laboriously, they're still paying more per capita for the defence of Europe than several European countries. What are we really whinging about? What are we whinging about? It's just because we have this hysterical aesthetic dislike of the Trump regime, and it's just rubbish. Honestly, stick with NATO is by far our best bet.
All right. Well, said with absolute clarity, and I thank you for that. Now, we're in Norway. Norway's a relatively small country, and just generally, do you think that the way the world is going, and we're talking about, all three of you in different ways have not been entirely optimistic about the state of collective security arrangements and the future of the idea of collective security. Does that make the world an ever more dangerous place for small countries, or even medium-sized countries?
I think almost inevitably. Small countries have less capacity to set their own course. determine their own fate, and they are easily trampled when great powers start getting into trouble. So, when I don't need to tell Norwegians, if Germany hadn't invaded in 1940, it would have been Great Britain that did. Not because Great Britain was angry at the Norwegians, but because they saw the territory as a strategic asset in the event of a major war in Europe, and so did the Germans, and so they both coveted it. And that's the kind of thing that happens to small countries in wars between major powers. So a major conflict is one where others get dragged in a whole variety of different ways, whether they want to be in them or not. That's why a great power conflict is to be avoided.
Let's talk about what it is that we're defending. Are we defending borders and territory, or are we defending people and the right to freedom and democracy? And I think small countries have been incredibly effective at doing that, because they're smaller, they have more possibilities for democratic discussion. I think the Nordic countries are all to be applauded in this sense. And I think small countries also recognize that we do need multilateral arrangements, and have been incredibly important in strengthening norms and multilateral arrangements. There would have been a big difference between British occupation and German occupation, actually, and that relates to this idea that what we should be talking about is democracy. I mean, think about it. If Russia had been a democratic country, I don't think the Russian speakers in Ukraine would have been that determined to defend Ukraine. It's all been about democracy. And so I think this, and that's where I think small countries have an enormous advantage. And that also relates to who we should be talking to, because I think there's like-minded groups of countries that can be in Latin America, it could be Canada, who are really committed to pursuing a multilateral system and security-based, collective security.
Yeah, you just talked about the importance of democracy. Boris, do you have as much faith as you perhaps ever had in the notion that, more democracy, more free market capitalism means, more chance of peace and stability for the long term? The idea, going back to Francis Fukuyama and his sort of triumphalism at the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet system, he basically said, history's come to an end. This is the triumph of free markets and democracy, and we can all go to bed tonight feeling really rather content and happy and secure about our future. Do you still believe that democracy and free market capitalism are the pathway to peace and stability across the world?
Well, I agree very much with what Mary just said about democracy. I think on the whole, democracies don't go to war with each other. And I mean, I don't know where this thing came about Britain wanting to invade Norway in 1940. we did try to help Norway, and one of the reasons that Chamberlain was kicked out of office was because that whole project failed, and we had the famous Norway debate, and Winston Churchill came to power with a different agenda. I'm just completely baffled by that. Of all the charges that could be laid against Britain, the idea that we wanted to invade this beautiful country, you invaded us.
I didn't say you wanted to. No. You had plans to do so for strategic reasons, not because you wanted to, because you felt you might have to.
This is another of those lovely sort of diversions like Mary teaching Viktor Orban, which are absolutely fascinating, but not necessarily taking us direct to the point. But the point was whether you are as confident as Francis Fukuyama was all those years ago, that in the end we are going to witness in this world of ours the triumph of democracy and liberal philosophy and free market economics.
I think so, but I've got to, for the reasons I gave right at the beginning, I think that when people, citizens around the world look at the choices that they can make for themselves and for their families about goods they want to buy or places of education they want their kids to attend, music they want to listen to, it's overwhelmingly still the West that has the most compelling offer. But you know, we've got to be honest and say that, sadly, capitalism with Chinese characteristics, or whatever you call it, does seem capable also of producing technological innovation on a formidable scale. We have to think about it, and we cannot be complacent. I believe that our system is great. I think it's better, but we have to make the argument. And I think your phrase earlier, Mary, about democratic resilience, I agree totally with that. We do need more democratic resilience. We need to be more confident about democracy and in the sovereign right of the people to kick out politicians and keep going. It's the worst system in the world except for all the others. And
yeah,
you've got to believe in it.
Your hand's up, Mary, so very quick, because we're getting toward the close, and I've got a couple of things I'm going to ask.
Okay, I just wanted to say something about Fukuyama and free market capitalism. It depends what you mean by free market capitalism, because the tragedy for Eastern Europe was actually that it happened at a moment when ideas of market fundamentalism were sweeping the world. And in fact, what they got was not a transition to capitalism, but a transition to kleptocracy. And that's what caused all of the problems that we're facing. And so, yes, we need free markets, but we also need social safety nets, we also need regulation, we need laws, trust, all kinds of other things. So you have to be very careful about what you mean by free market capitalism.
Very, very briefly, I just wanted to add, this is the one issue where I think everybody on the panel agrees. We are all big fans of democracy. We would like to see more of it in more places. I think the thing that worries, at least some of us more than others, is that some of the leading democratic countries seem less devoted to the idea. Right, where you have in the United States, I think, significant erosions of democracy, this idea of a unitary executive, that we don't want all the messiness of Congress actually having control of the purse. The president should decide that. We now have a Supreme Court that seems to want to give the president greater powers, moving in a variety of directions. And as the other Stephen pointed out, we do have a president who tried to reject the results of the previous election that he had lost, right? And refuses to acknowledge to this day that he lost that election fair and square. That's an erosion of democratic norms that's very dangerous. So we all believe in democracy. We'd like to see it do better. We may disagree on where the dangers lie.
Yeah, no, well put. Now, look, we're almost out of time, and I did promise that I might ask you all briefly to address other challenges beyond sort of war and peace that collective approaches are going to be required if we are to even get close to coming up with solutions for. So I'm obviously thinking about climate change. I'm thinking about, and you've all talked about it at different times, nuclear non-proliferation, trying to sort of de-risk our world from total apocalypse. And one could also talk about technology and the degree to which only international collaboration is going to stop technology doing things to us as a species that we might not want. Very briefly, almost to the point of yes or no, do you believe these huge planet-sized challenges are going to be met by effective collective action? How optimistic are you that that can and will be done? Start with you, Stephen, then we'll
Unfortunately, I am not optimistic, and one of the reasons I'm not optimistic is that some major powers are in denial about some of them. And if you're denying that there's a problem, you're not likely to do very much to fix it. But secondly, I am deeply troubled by the fact that you have a series of things happening simultaneously. Shift in the balance of power, potentially catastrophic China's climate change, technological advances that are happening in multiple fields at a very, very rapid rate. All of these things happening simultaneously at a moment where also, as I indicated, a lot of international institutions are starting to erode. So I fear the number of challenges is actually going to exceed the bandwidth of the political system in countries and between countries to respond to them. Okay. Too much to deal with all at once.
And to your list, I would add financial speculation and the risk, very real risk of an AI bubble now, which could have catastrophic consequences. What I want to say is very quickly two things. One is that if we can't resolve these collective issues, it's really a problem also for democracy. Because although we may have the most perfect democratic procedures, our ability to influence the decisions that affect our lives is limited when those decisions have to be taken at a global level. You know, we can't affect financial markets. We can't affect the decision of multinational corporations. We can't affect climate change. And so it's really about the future of democracy as well. So that's one point. And the other point is, am I hopeful? And my only hope is what I said at the end, which is global public opinion. I do believe in the power of social pressures, and I think the Cold War came to an end not because the US was militarily powerful, but because of pressures both from the peace movement and from the human rights movements. And they led the 1989 revolutions. And that's given me a kind of optimism about social movements. And there is a predominant global, and the extent to which that can influence politics. I think we're going to go through some really tumultuous times before this has any effect, but there is a new, very committed, inspired generation that I teach every day.
Thank you, Mary. Boris, I mean,
Not every day,
as I said before, you are the only one amongst us who has actually been the Prime Minister, and that is something worth, I think, reminding ourselves. But you've had to sit with that responsibility. So just in terms of those sort of potentially existential challenges for all of us, you know, as the human race, as a species, you know, climate change and what it could do to us, nuclear proliferation and what it could do to all of us, and indeed the march of technology and what it could do to all of us. Did you leave office thinking, oh, Jesus, these are just issues that no leader can possibly get even close to, you know, coming up with solutions?
So nuclear proliferation, I was interested in what Stephen said. Yes, the stunning thing, 80 years or whatever it is after the invention of the atomic bomb, is how few countries actually have nuclear weapons and how they have not proliferated. On climate change, I was very proud of what the UK did at the Glasgow COP in 2021. We got substantial commitments globally to reduce CO2, and I think that technology can fix it. I think that the growth of AI will put huge demands on our electricity system. We've got to find a way of having more clean, green, renewable power. And I know that Norway agrees strongly with that. But there's one, we will ultimately fix these environmental problems because we're a supremely ingenious species. But there's one way that this will be solved, and it's through a crisis that isn't a crisis. I keep reading in the media that we have a demographic crisis. Well, I say, what crisis?
Yeah, but you've got a lot of children.
I have, but you know that's fine. I can pay for them. I do. I have 9. I'm very proud of it. But they are part of an overall declining or stabilizing global population, and I think that is a good thing. If environmentalists ask what is the way of fixing the human impact on the planet, it is basically to stabilize the growth of the human, and that is happening. It's happening naturally. And rather than moaning about it and panicking about it, as the Financial Times seems to be doing, I don't know quite why, I think we should look at we're going to sort out our environmental problems naturally.
Well, it's good to hear some positivity. Now, I'm instructed, because we are pretty much at an end, you may or may not be relieved to know, but but I want you all, I've been instructed that you all must give us a concluding thought, only possibly 2.5 to 3 minutes long, but no longer. Just sum up your feelings at the end of this debate, you know, bearing in mind it's been about collective security, but you can rove far and wide. But just give us, each of you, a summation of what you're feeling as you walk away from Bergen. Stephen, you start.
So I've enjoyed the conversation a great deal, and I'm sorry we couldn't have heard from all of you, because I suspect most of you have really interesting questions to ask and opinions to share with the rest of us. That would be an experience of participatory democracy and debate, which might have been useful. So I've been sort of the doom and gloom representative on this panel, suggesting that there are lots of problems emerging and political systems that aren't doing a particularly good job of reaching them. And let me end, I guess, on an optimistic note. A little bit like Boris, I do think, we're a very inventive species, and we often rise to the occasion. If I want to take some elements of optimism from the current situation, I think it's actually a good thing that my country isn't running around the world now invading other countries and trying to tell them what to do and how to run their societies. I think that with the best of intentions, we caused a bunch of inadvertent harm, and I'm glad we've recovered. I think we've overcorrected in certain respects. So I think that's good. I'm glad that Europe is finally having a conversation about no longer being, at least in security terms, largely a vassal of the United States and very deferential to American whims. That was a great gig for a while from Europe. You got a lot of protection at relatively low cost, but it wasn't going to last forever, and I think you're now being forced to move on. Even if the United States remains in NATO, the role will be reduced. America's attention is going to be elsewhere, and that's sort of the optimistic version of that particular story. And then finally, I do think I want to endorse a few things Mary has said about concentrations of political power and the political objectives of some of the people who are running countries. I think she's on to something when she suggests that, yes, they all pursue the national interest as they define it, but there are an awful lot of leaders out there, including in my own country, where the national interest is sometimes being confused with the personal financial interest. In various ways, and that's unfortunate. Keeping those two as firmly separate is a good thing. That's not the case in Russia. That's not the case in Turkey. That's not the case in Hungary. That's not the case in a number of other countries I would name, where the personal and the financial get merged. And I think the people that lose in those circumstances are everybody else. Right? Leaders get rich, their cronies get rich, everybody else is less rich than they might otherwise be. That's a task of the political system in those countries to solve. That's a task for democratic renewal and resilience. But whether or not that succeeds is always an open question, and how long it takes is something I am not smart enough to forecast.
Thank you, Stephen. Mary?
Well, the weird thing is that people think I'm optimistic. I think I have an optimistic way of talking. But actually, I'm not really optimistic, and that's because of the places I study. If you look at what's happening in Sudan, you look at what's happening in Palestine, you look at what's happening in Syria, it's very difficult to see a route out of this kind of endless violence where various oligarchs on a sort of minor local scale are all making money from predation and from violence. And it's a kind of social condition that actually characterizes large parts of the world, Eastern Africa, the Middle East, this is what I'm really alarmed about, that this is maybe the direction we're heading. And I just wanted to say finally that, like Stephen, I really had a fun time today. It was really an enjoyable debate. And what I really hope is it was such a good idea to have this debate. We desperately need a public debate. These decisions are being taken by elites, and they don't reflect public opinion in Europe, the kind of decisions that are being taken about increased defense spending, about the possibility of a European nuclear deterrent. And yet somehow the public has not got engaged in these debates. And that, for me, is the key priority now.
The power of public engagement. Well, that's an important idea to walk away with. Boris, give us your closing.
Well, I want to thank everybody very much for having me, and to my fellow panelists. I think it's been a wonderful, stimulating conversation. Look, I'm not going to pretend that I love everything about the current US administration. All I'm trying to say in a humble kind of way is, be careful what you wish for with strategic European autonomy. I think NATO has served us well. Stick with NATO, stick with democracy, stick with the engagement with America. Do our best to encourage an outward-looking America, because I think the instinct is there. But then on the big issues that Mary has raised, we really haven't talked enough about that. The gap between the super rich and the poor in the world, the continuing instability of states like Sudan, which Mary has mentioned, Afghanistan. These are much of sub-Saharan Africa, the Sahel. And I have I believe that technologically we can fix a lot of our problems, but there's a very, very simple solution, in my view, to many of the problems in these parts of the world. And it's an uncomfortable one, because we don't like to sound as though we're preaching or we're sounding, culturally superior. But it is an absolute... I've just been in Nigeria, which is going to be the most populous country in the world by the end of the century, according to current projections. But 37...
Beyond India?
Yeah, they get 30 by 2100. But 37% of women in Nigeria cannot read. In many other African countries, it is higher, certainly in Sudan. In Pakistan, it's 60%. In Afghanistan, they're now stopping kids, females, girls from going to school again. And all the evidence is that if you want to fix the problems of the world, if you want to tackle extremism, if you want to infant mortality, whatever it happens to be, if you want to tackle the problems of the environment, if you want political engagement, give girls the same education as boys. And it would be... Everybody applauds this in this audience, but you don't hear it, I'm afraid to say, from the development agencies, because they don't want to sound as though they're preaching or indeed going against the religious precepts of people they're dealing with. And that is an absolute scandal. So what I do want to see active engagement across the world in teaching girls to read and write to the same level as boys. Every girl should have 12 years of quality education. That is the Swiss Army knife to fix global problems. And if we get that right, in the next 20, 30 years, we will dramatically change the fortunes of the world.
And talking of fixing global problems, does Boris Johnson still have a desire to re-enter politics to try to help to fix some of those problems?
I've had a very wonderful time, and I think that I've enjoyed.
You're very good at not answering questions. If you
I would look. I think it's as I've said many times before. I think I've got more chance of being reincarnated as an olive.
Ah, yeah.
Or decapitated by a frisbee, or locked in a disused fridge. Or whatever.
I think you've done that once. You don't need to do that one again.
I think it's highly unlikely.
Highly unlikely. All right. Well,
my party is very, very happy at the moment. No, I mean,
I'm not sure it is actually, but anyway, that's not a debate for today.
Well, they're happy with that meaning.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I don't know about you, but I think these three panelists have given us, and Ludwig Holberg would be thrilled with them, because they've opened their minds. They've, in his words, they've sort of shown something about the divine light of reason. They've certainly given us enlightenment, and God knows Holberg was keen on enlightenment. I'm so grateful to all three of you for just giving us the time, the energy that you've given us. Please join me in giving them a huge thank you.
Thank you.
And ladies and gentlemen, thank you. Thank you so much. I mean, thank you to everybody who's been watching on the live stream, or indeed, apparently there was some jumbo video screen in a student campus where people were watching as well, and all the 1,000 people who couldn't get tickets. We thank you for trying. Honestly, it's been such a pleasure being with you in Bergen. Thank you all very much for turning out tonight. That is pretty much it from us, but the final thanks goes to you. So thank you very much indeed.